Welcome to The Self-Made Theory, the podcast that's all about innovating, overcoming, and prospering. We interview founders, entrepreneurs, innovators, CEOs, and other exciting people about their amazing business journey. Over to your host, Ben Campbell, for this week's episode.
Welcome back to The Self-Made Theory. In this episode, I interviewed Jim Whalley, who has been appointed as the Chief Entrepreneur for South Australia. Now, while it might seem strange to interview a government employee for a show that's all about founders and entrepreneurs, Jim just doesn't fit the mould of what many might consider a typical government employee. Firstly, he isn't paid. It's a volunteer position, and he has a great track record in building successful business here in South Australia. If you look at his photos on my website and look into his background, you might see him as a bit of a cross between Tom Cruise and Richard Branson, and he's certainly no slow-moving bureaucrat. He's a make-it-happen type of guy. We discuss some important and interesting topics like executing and planning a business is not dissimilar to a fighter jet mission. We talk about the first ever visa scheme that's designed to attract entrepreneurs to Australia, and Jim puts dodgy operators on notice. There's no place for you in the entrepreneurial community. My name is Ben Campbell, and this is The Self-Made Theory. Jim Whalley, welcome to The Self-Made Theory.
Ben, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Now, we're down in Lot 14, which is your new home, really, isn't it?
This is my new kingdom as Chief Entrepreneur for South Australia. And your listeners will note that there's the odd bang and
Hammond reel and other things.
That's because things are going on down here. We're building an entrepreneurial neighbourhood.
Which is pretty exciting.
Very exciting.
Now, we're quite similar. I didn't realise how similar that you and I are. So you have an MBA.
We're both very good looking, or
well, there is that.
Yes,
but this is radio, and so listeners can't quite see that.
People have often said to me that I've got a face for radio.
So you have an MBA.
I do, from the University of Adelaide.
I have an MBA.
Yep.
You're passionate about entrepreneurship here in South Australia.
I am.
I'm passionate about entrepreneurship here in South Australia. Well, you're a fighter pilot.
I was, yeah.
And I think that's where the similarity ends.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about who Jim Whalley is.
Sure. Okay, so born and raised in Melbourne, and then joined the Air Force straight out of school, which I'd always wanted to do as a kid. I had a bit of influence. Dad was a pilot during the Second World War.
Yes.
So joined the Air Force, went to the Air Force Academy and then the Australian Defence Force Academy, did my pilot training, flew an aeroplane called a Caribou for a couple of years, and then was selected to go to fly fighters. So I flew F-18s in total for about 8 or 9 years, which was fantastic fun. I got to go to test pilot school, to the quaintly named Empire Test Pilot School in the UK, a place called Boscombe Down. Flew all sorts of wonderful things, everything from Jaguars and Tornadoes to helicopters and transport aircraft and all sorts of wonderful things. So that was great fun. And then that brought me back to Adelaide, to the Air Force Flight Test Establishment, the Aircraft Research and Development Unit, where I sort of kept flying F-18s and doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And then, typical story, I met an Adelaide girl, and that sort of ruined my Air Force career. Fortunately, at the time, I was doing an MBA, which I thought would be useful if I was ever going to reach for the upper echelons of the Air Force.
And you were doing that here at...
I was doing that at Adelaide Uni, yeah, which was a really fabulous experience. Absolutely loved it.
And so why was that? What drove you to think that an MBA was right for you?
It literally was, because there weren't too many fighter pilots at the time that had MBAs, and I thought if I was going to have a career in the Air Force, that would be a useful skill. Obviously, flying jet fighters is important, but as you progress through the Air Force, you take command and leadership roles, and understanding, I guess, a bit more of that. I thought was important, and particularly in perhaps the non-defence context. The Defence Force do a great job at leadership and management training, but the focus is on operational capability and warfighting, as opposed to business and finance and accounting and all those sorts of things. So I thought that extra set of skills would be useful. And look, as it turned out, when I met my wife Melinda, and decided that it was a a case of change of career if we were going to stay together. That MBA was really useful, and I started up a business. Despite the incompetence of senior management, that business has done pretty well.
So what drove you to start the business?
Look, I'm an entrepreneur by necessity. It literally was after leaving the Air Force. As one of my uni professors said to me, the only thing you're qualified to do is drop bombs on people and shoot aeroplanes out of the sky. So you're probably going to find it difficult to get a job. So it seemed more sensible to create one myself. So I did, and the business was very much about providing engineering services to defence, particularly in the area of flight test. And there had been a commercialisation of a lot of defence work in the years prior to me to leaving the Air Force. So there was an opportunity there, and it worked well.
So most people might consider that the Defence Force or any large organisation like that is rigid, structured, very organised, very planned, very, we have 10 and 20-year plans in place to build these defence capabilities. How does that compare with the entrepreneur world? And it does seem strange that somebody who's had that background can lead the state as the chief entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The world of fighter flying is very dynamic and very outcome focused. And whilst there is a lot of work done on safety and procedures and bits and pieces like that, you need people that can make quick decisions in fast moving environments. And certainly that was the case with being a test pilot as well. It was about small teams working on complex problems and creating outcomes. So interestingly enough, I sort of sometimes joke about it, but there's a lot of truth in it that when I started up the business, it literally was a flight test program. It was just a flight test program for a business instead of an aircraft. And there's lessons learned, there's experimentation. You got to have fuel, you got to have money. You've got to have a purpose and a focus of what you're trying to achieve. And many of those things translated directly into Nova Systems, the business I started. So I think also, whilst there is a perception sometimes of defence as large and bureaucratic, often the opposite is true. Certainly with the flight test teams I was working with, they were small, high performance teams, very, very qualified people, very outcome focused, working hard to achieve an aim. And a lot of the people that are in my organisation now come from that same background out of defence.
Yeah, right. I was at an entrepreneur event last week at Moonshine, and I was talking to one of the business founders there, and we're talking about OODA loops.
Yep.
And how relevant that was to an entrepreneurial startup community.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have lots of other acronyms in defence, but that whole process of thinking of outcomes, of planning a mission, executing it, administrating it, controlling it, all those sorts of things are things that, and a lot of strategy, business strategy has had its foundations in military strategy.
What most people wouldn't know about your position as the Chief Entrepreneur of South Australia is that it's a volunteer position.
It is.
Doesn't the South Australian government have enough to pay you?
No, look, they have, but they did say that if I do really well, they're going to double my pay. Look, South Australia's been really good to me. The Premier Stephen Marshall asked me if I'd do this. As I say,
so why did he ask you? What was it that stood you out from?
Well, probably
from
because the preceding 15 people had said no. Hopefully I'm joking. Look, I think I'd had the benefit of a successful business, which is still growing. I think I've generally had good relationships across the political spectrum. I hope I'm seen as someone that's reasonably well balanced, reasonably connected in the business community, and also someone that likes to contribute. And I joined the Defence Force and the Air Force not to make money. I joined it because I wanted to fly aeroplanes and serve the nation. I don't know. Maybe those characteristics were part of the process.
And so, why did you choose the role, or why did you take on the role? Given your commitment to running a business, and given it has quite a big commitment in terms of time.
Look, it does. But as I say, look, South Australia's been very good to me. And I stepped down as CEO of my own business 2 years ago. So I sit as chairman of the board and a consultant and do a few other bits and pieces. So there was the time to do it. I've got 6 kids. I want them to have opportunities and careers in South Australia. Now, I don't want them. That doesn't mean they necessarily need to stay here from the get-go, but if my daughter goes off and studies overseas and does some great stuff and becomes a businesswoman, I want her to feel that there's opportunities if she comes back and to contribute to the state and have family and friends here and always regard this as a home and be able to have a home here, but also to be able to have all the professional opportunities that you can get anywhere else.
Absolutely. New South Wales Labor Department's just recently stated that they're going to appoint a chief entrepreneur.
They're clearly copying South Australia.
What does Oscar Wilde say? That imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Absolutely.
Why is it important for governments to have this role?
Look, I think it's a really good focal point. Someone asked me about said to me that's a very grand title, and it is a grand title, and I think it does create a focal point for entrepreneurship. I think facilities like Lot 14, where we're sitting at the moment, where your listeners can hear the sound of hammers and saws going off, is also a physical manifestation and focal point for entrepreneurship. So creating a sense of entrepreneurship is not just about government policy. It's not just about people talking about it. It's about having people, personalities and facilities that are clearly focused on entrepreneurial outcomes. And I think the title of Chief Entrepreneur is just one other way of achieving that.
I've often described to clients and others that Silicon Valley or that type of place is really an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Perhaps not dissimilar to, say, the Great Barrier Reef, where you've got a whole bunch of structure, large fish, small fish, all feeding each other and growing this amazing
eating
thing.
each other and sort of,
well, there is
popping everywhere and stuff.
Acquiring, perhaps, is a better word for it. But that's often what a true ecosystem is. How focused are you on sort of the smaller startups and the scale-ups versus the large organisations that need to feed into that system?
Yeah, look, sure. The answer is very. The remit for the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur is wide into the regions, Cooper Pedy down to Mount Gambier. It's across industries, across sectors, and across age groups and people. Everything from a young kid at school who's maybe created a software program for her friends and is selling that, to someone that's maybe a retired welder or something like that that's decided they're going to make really unique garden furniture or outdoor furniture and sell it to the world. We want to create that entrepreneurial spirit and buzz. And it is, you're exactly right, it is an ecosystem. I think one of the problems we've had in the past with the ecosystem, particularly in South Australia, it hasn't been that connected. And certainly, one of my jobs and the jobs of the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur is to make sure that ecosystem is better connected, that we have the entrepreneurs, the startups, they have access and connectivity with larger companies, with mentors, private equity, with VC, with the institutions that will give them the skills to take their ideas to commercial reality, that they can mix it with clients and customers. It's very much about us having a light touch, but putting people together and connecting them and creating those networks.
That's a big piece when you think about it in that broad context. There must be a team that sits behind you. Given that you're a volunteer, there must be a bunch of people that sit behind you. Tell me about the team.
So, look, we've got a really great entrepreneurial advisory board, or entrepreneurship advisory board.
I've met a couple of those.
You've met some of them, Anton and Jenny Paradiso, for example, who are fantastic entrepreneurs on their own. George Freeney, Mohan Koo, Flavia, Tata Nardini from Fleet, Steve Butler from Stillmark Telecommunications, all entrepreneurs. And they're all providing, again, freely of their time to help us advise policy and strategy for the state government. But we've also got a team of professionals in the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur who are part of the state government, a really impressive bunch of people with really impressive backgrounds and credentials that are geared very much to supporting all the work we're doing. So, the team, basically, if you include a few of the others in DIS, is probably about 20 people. So there's a fair bit of horsepower behind it.
That's a lot of investment by the state government.
It totally is. And this site has basically $500 million alone invested into it. And, it is a big ask to create those networks, but this site in particular, I think, is going to be, is going to make that job much easier, because if we've got all those people in one place, in a place like Lot 14, in a place like Tonsley, in some of the other facilities and organisations and incubators around the state, then I think it just makes that connectivity so much easier.
I agree. I interviewed Kelly from Expose recently, and you could see the excitement when she was talking about Lot 14 and the other organisations that are going to be here and the possibilities that will come out of that close collaboration.
Absolutely.
It does sound like it certainly is going to pay benefits.
Oh, look, I think it's hugely exciting. exciting. I mean, I don't know, Ben, as you rove around the state, I certainly, when I get to talk to people about this, and I have been doing it for the last 6 months, there is a genuine enthusiasm and level of excitement for what's going on down here. And not only amongst entrepreneurs and potential startups, but amongst the business community in South Australia and Adelaide more broadly. I think it's it's really, really positive.
What was the state of the ecosystem prior to you starting?
Look, I think there's always been some really, really great stuff in South Australia, and that actually goes back to our history as the only state that was settled by free settlers. So there was the history of the state is one of entrepreneurship and freedom of speech and tolerance. Where the city of churches, not because we have lots of churches, but because we had synagogue next to mosque next to a Christian church, and so I think there was a really, really good basis here for entrepreneurship from a technology point of view. If you look at the number of Nobel laureates per capita in South Australia, I think if you're doing the numbers, we sit somewhere between Sweden and Switzerland. So there are great universities, there's great technology, there's great work done here, and particularly given our population is relatively small. But one of the things that struck me, and which I thought was strange given the population and the fact that most people in Adelaide know each other, was the lack of connectivity. And I think that's one of the things we're working hard on, is just making sure the entrepreneurs know each other, the entrepreneurs know the financiers, they know the private equity, they know the venture capitalists, they know the angels, they have the support network, they know who they need to talk to for legal advice, for marketing advice, for government relations advice, all those sorts of important parts of creating a business. And I think that's the thing that was perhaps lacking, and that we're working really hard to change.
And we've got an opportunity almost better than anywhere else.
Look, I think that's the beauty of Adelaide, and this is why it was so strange to me, because Adelaide is a small city, and South Australia is, from a population point of view, small state. Now, it's not obviously geographically, but the level of connectivity in South Australia and Adelaide specifically, I think, is very high. And it just seems that is such a great opportunity to connect the people that we need to create businesses and do good stuff.
Have you been appointed to the role for a period of time?
Yes. So my appointment is 2 years.
And what do you hope the end of 2 years looks like? Do you have some targets set for yourself?
We're going through the process at the moment of coming up with KPIs, and I'm certainly keen on getting some very hard quantifiable KPIs. I'm a big believer, going test pile background, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So we're on the process of just finding some hard quantitative KPIs. I would like things like revenue from companies less than 5 years old in South Australia, revenue from companies less than 3 years old in South Australia. We've got to work out ways to get that data in a timely, cost-efficient and rigorous way.
Well, a lot of that's often private data too, right? So,
yeah, some of it's not so much private. Well, it's covered by privacy law. Sorry, that's exactly the case. The issue is often you need to collate data from several government departments, and doing that is not without its challenges and without its costs. So we want to do it in a reasonable sort of way. We want to be able to have longitudinal studies so that we can see trends, but I'd also like to see us being able to benchmark ourselves against best practice and what's going on not only in the rest of Australia but the rest of the world. So that's a big part of it, is getting those measures and actually seeing we're achieving. But in very broad terms for me, it's probably 5 years from now that the Office of Chief Entrepreneur is still going strong. The person or people that succeed me are orders of magnitude more competent and capable. And, that's the job of every CEO, to make themselves dispensable. But the office is well respected for what it's achieving. And Adelaide is seen as South Australia, but Adelaide as a city is seen as the go-to state for entrepreneurship, particularly in technology fields and the other things that were really good, like biotech, agtech, all those other things, and creative industries.
So what about beyond Australia? Do you have a remit to promote South Australia as the place to start your company or to grow your company outside of Australia?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we've got is an entrepreneurial visa scheme. So for entrepreneurs that are overseas and want to come to South Australia, we're piloting the first ever scheme in Australia that will allow those entrepreneurs to move to South Australia and start up their companies. So absolutely, definitely, our remit goes beyond South Australian and Australian borders. We want to get investors in from overseas, whether it's Europe or the US or wherever. We want to get companies, and many of those Australians, that have gone off overseas and done great things. We want to bring them back home and say, hey, there are some great opportunities here. I was recently in the US with the Premier, and we were talking to several people in the space industry, for example, and they were saying, these are people that have left Australia, years and years ago and created great careers for themselves and great companies. And they were all saying, hey, I want my kids to be raised as Australians. I want to come home as a time. And we're saying, yeah, it is. Now, there is some really amazing stuff going on. The announcement of the
mission control yesterday.
Yeah, mission control, but the space agency at the International Astronautical Conference a couple of years ago, and that in November last year, that the space agency would be based here, right here in Lot 14, was I think really great. And the space piece does a whole lot of great stuff. It's great for supporting engineering and technology, but it's also really great for inspiration, for getting young kids wanting to be involved in STEM and those sorts of things. And I hope we can take that to the next step and say, be involved in STEM and innovation and technology, be involved also in the commercialisation, the entrepreneurship to create great South Australian companies.
Some interesting conversations yesterday with some young people about the fact that mission control is now going to be here.
Yeah.
Really? Mission control in Adelaide? Yeah, in the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site. People were going, wow, that's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, and our intent to have mission control very visible to the public, so people literally will be able to walk past it and see what's going on in there. Now, there'll be occasions when they're doing work that is a bit more sensitive, but for the most part, we want the public to see what's going on this site and be inspired by it.
I know you'd mentioned before in the media that you want to make heroes of entrepreneurs.
Yep.
And this podcast is all about celebrating and talking about the stories that entrepreneurs bring to life. But one of the things we talk about very little is that along the way, failure happens.
Yep.
Challenges happen, failure happens, etc. And one of the things that I think particularly in South Australia, we're not great at shouting from the rooftops how great we are.
Yep.
We're even worse at saying, mistakes happen.
Yeah, sure.
I imagine, as a person who's grown a business yourself, you probably have stumbled along the way, through various things. Is there anything you're happy to share with us?
Several, yeah. Look, I've had, and in fact, failure is a good point to talk about, but I prefer to use the term experimentation. And I think, again, I'll go back to my flying experience. It was all about making mistakes that didn't kill you. But maybe just embarrass you. And I think that's in many ways true of business as well.
I like it. It's a good one.
Look, I think the experimentation stuff is something we've really got to focus on. There is an issue, I think, with fear of failure in for much of the Australian community. And I think in some ways I think it's getting worse. With our kids, we really are concerned about their safety and all that sort of stuff. I don't think we let our kids experiment as much. Whether it's in a playground or in other areas. And I think we've got to create those safe environments where people can experiment and fail and learn from those mistakes and as I say, not be killed and maybe just embarrass themselves a bit. I think also, we have got a whole issue with the tall poppy syndrome here. The assumption in Australia generally is if you drive a Ferrari, you must have stolen it from someone. Or you've ripped someone off. I'd like to change that paradigm around so that if someone's done really well and they happen to have bought themselves a Ferrari or a nice car, we don't look upon that with jealousy. We look upon that as, hey, that's someone that's worked hard and contributed back to the state. They've created a company, they've created jobs, and maybe they have rewarded themselves, and that's a good thing, and that's something that we should aspire to.
And that's right, aspiration versus jealousy.
Absolutely.
That's the key, isn't it? You want people to look at that and go, wow, if you can do that, why can't I do that?
Absolutely.
Right? And that drives that spirit for everybody to
entrepreneurship.
achieve.
Absolutely. I think the other part of it too is when people do fail, one of the great Australian traits is the ability to laugh at the misfortune of others. When someone does have a hiccup and it goes badly wrong, particularly where they've behaved with good intent, that instead of walking past them and having a bit of a giggle, we do extend a hand out and say, hey, what did you learn from that? How can we help you do better next time? I think we do need to change that. I'll use the term social paradigm so that we celebrate the wins and the successes, and we do make heroes of the entrepreneurs. But those people who actually have a go and get up and continue trying, we should be celebrating them as well, because that takes real resilience, and that is equally important. I think the other side of this, though, is that entrepreneurship in Australia, I think, we expect our business people to have a social agenda as well and to do the right thing, to be thinking about social responsibility, to be thinking about sustainability. And I think in South Australia in particular, we've always been a very generous society, and we should be combining as much as possible the entrepreneurship we have here with a social element. Now, that can take all sorts of different forms.
Yep.
Might be using suppliers that have got a genuine social entrepreneur agenda, or genuinely being a social entrepreneur yourself. But it's also important so that people do the right thing. And, if we're going to make entrepreneurs heroes, that they are contributing back to society in all sorts of different ways. Equally, though, those people that use entrepreneurship as an excuse for bad behaviour, for not, paying their suppliers, for not paying their employees superannuation, for treating their customers badly, all those sorts of stuff, those people are not entrepreneurs in my view, and they need to be taken out and identified.
Taken out how exactly?
Well, I won't use the military term for that. They need to be identified. Entrepreneurs out there need to identify those people that are giving us a bad name. Now,
do you think that's a problem in South Australia? I mean, South Australia is very visible. It's very hard to hide in this community.
Yeah, it is. I think there's the odd entrepreneur out there that thinks they can get away with it. I don't think it's commonplace.
Yep.
But I'd like to say to them, you are on notice. As I say, if myself, the Entrepreneurship Advisory Board and the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur are going to make heroes of the entrepreneurs, those ones that want to jump on that train and don't want to live the life that's required, they will get pushed off the train very quickly, probably into a train coming the other way.
Listeners, there's no smile on his face when he's talking about that.
It's an important part. I think it is. I think, not unreasonably, society expects us as business people to do the right thing. And I think, all the things we've heard about lately with royal commissions and banks and all that sort of stuff are indicative not only of, lack of process and procedure, but I think lack of ethics, what is regarded as ethical and moral behaviour. And I think as entrepreneurs, we create that paradigm ourselves. We should make sure we create the right one.
And there's no benefit for the state or anybody else when royal commissions happen and other things.
Whatsoever.
The distract and lack of focus then on customers and driving good outcomes is just it's just crazy. So one of the things you talk about, in an article that I read about how important speed was. And you also referenced a time in your business where you'd made an acquisition and you hadn't done enough due diligence. How do you balance the right amount of due diligence, which can often be a long, arduous process, with speed to market and, revving up your capability?
Look, it's a really difficult one, and it literally is one of those how long is a piece of string questions, because you can take a year of due diligence and come up with a perfect solution, but then you've missed the opportunity. And it literally is that paradigm of time, information, and effectiveness. Interestingly, again, I'll go back to my aviation background. As a pilot, particularly as a fighter pilot and a test pilot, often you are expected with a limited amount of information to make a decision very quickly. And the reason you have to make it quickly is because it will be ineffective otherwise. The other aircraft that you're fighting against will be past you or, in your shorts pretty rapidly. For a lot of the people in my own company, for example, those with a strong engineering background, the paradigm and philosophy they are used to is getting a lot of information, making a very, very well-informed decision, and it having the appropriate effect. Getting that balance for business and entrepreneurship is really important. So I think sometimes you either need to recognise that, or you need to recognise there are other people that are good at taking longer to make well-informed decisions. And if the effectiveness does not change, then get more information, make a good decision. But if the effectiveness is in the next 1 minute or 5 weeks, understand you're going to have limited information and you're going to have to make a call one way or the other.
And hopefully it's not fatal.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
So companies out there listening, entrepreneurs out there listening, people out there inspired by what's happening here in South Australia, what advice do you have for them?
Oh, look, give it a go. If you've got a good idea, have a think about whether you can turn that into commercial reality. Don't be naive about it. Having a good idea is one thing, but you also need to equip yourself with the skills. You need to understand how to write a business plan. You need to understand about financing. You need to understand what cash flow is. You need to be able to do a pitch. So equip yourself with the skills, and the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur is here to help you find the providers of that education and training, and in some cases actually help provide it as well. Have a go at it. It can be really hard work, but it can be really, really rewarding. And for those of your listeners who maybe aren't entrepreneurs but have got friends or family that are, I'd say to you, support them. It's a hard road, but they're doing great things for South Australia. They're doing great things for the economy, and they can be really, really successful on that path. And, it's a lot nicer when you get the support of your friends and family around you on that path.
And it's great when you actually have supported someone along the way and you go, you know what, I was a part of that.
Totally.
I was there.
Yeah.
I was there at the beginning. I was, I gave them some money. I bought their product. I was, I was there at the very beginning.
Yeah,
That's pretty
it's
exciting.
Really satisfying. It's great to see those great stories. And, there are lots of them in South Australia. And, I want to make sure there's lots more.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great being with you, Ben. Thanks
Cheers.
very much. Cheers.
Pretty interesting conversation, hey? Big thanks to Jim for taking time out of his super busy schedule to record this interview and talk about how you can be supported in the South Australian entrepreneurial community. If you want to find out more about Jim, the Office for the Chief Entrepreneur, or FIXI, which is the Future Industry Exchange for Entrepreneurs here in South Australia, then I have a whole lot of info on my website, including some great photos. Head over to www.theselfmadetheory.com. Make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast app. Apple, Spotify, Pocket Casts. In fact, I'll lay down a challenge for you to find a podcast app that we're not on. Until next time, keep innovating, overcoming and prospering.